Prison is a place where you learn one rule faster than any other. You do not sleep deeply. You sleep lightly. You sleep with one ear open, and you never ever sleep like you feel safe. But that night, in a dimly lit cell block where silence felt heavier than noise, one man broke every unspoken rule. He lay on his bunk, flat on his back, hands resting calmly on his chest. His breathing was slow, controlled, almost peaceful. Too peaceful. Around him the prison never truly slept. Somewhere down the corridor metal scraped against concrete. A distant cough echoed. Shadows shifted behind rusted bars. Every inmate knew that nighttime was when mistakes were punished. And yet this man didn't move. Not when footsteps passed his cell. Not when voices whispered nearby. Not even when someone stopped for just a second longer than usual, staring at him through the bars. Anyone who had spent more than a week behind those walls would have felt it immediately. Something was wrong. Because men who survive in prison don't sleep like this. Men who last learn fear early. They learn tension. They learn to pretend. But this man wasn't pretending. His face showed no stress, no tension in the jaw, no twitching fingers. Even his posture was wrong, relaxed, open, vulnerable. And vulnerability in prison is an invitation. From the shadows, eyes watched him, calculating, measuring, asking a silent question. Is he stupid or is he hiding something? To most inmates, the answer seemed obvious. Weak men sleep deeply. Broken men stop caring. Easy targets don't wake up in time, and easy targets don't make it far. Still, something about the way this man slept bothered them. Not fear, hesitation. A feeling they couldn't explain. Because danger usually announces itself loudly in prison. This one didn't. The cell block returned to silence. The man's breathing remained slow, steady, almost deliberate. Which leads to the question no one could answer that night. In a place where sleep can get you killed, why would a man choose to sleep this peacefully? Because sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one who's awake. Would you sleep this openly in prison, yes or no? Comment below. Prison doesn't reward kindness. It doesn't forgive mistakes, and it never ignores weakness. Inside those walls, survival follows rules that are never written down, but always enforced. You learn them quickly, or you don't last long enough to learn anything at all. Rule 1, you don't stand out. Rule 2, you don't look comfortable. Rule 3, you never give anyone a reason to test you. That sleeping man broke all 3. In most prisons, nighttime is when power shifts hands. Guards grow fewer. Cameras miss angles. Sounds travel differently in the dark. This is when debts are collected, messages are sent, and lessons are taught. And lessons are usually brutal. Every inmate knew stories of men who slept too deeply. Men who thought exhaustion would protect them. Men who assumed no one was watching. Their stories always ended the same way, quietly and badly. That's why the man on the bunk made no sense. He wasn't new. New inmates sleep nervously. They twitch, they roll over. They wake at every sound. This man didn't. He wasn't old either. Older inmates develop habits, defensive sleeping positions, hidden weapons, a constant awareness of space. This man showed none of that. From a distance, he looked like someone who had already accepted whatever would happen to him. And in prison, acceptance looks exactly like permission. That's how predators think. They don't see people, they see opportunities. They scan for slumped shoulders, lowered eyes, hesitation in movement. They watch how others react to you. Respect is visible. So is the lack of it. And this man had no visible protection. No group, no reputation. No one sitting nearby pretending not to care. Which meant only one thing. He was alone. The men watching him had done this before. Many times. They knew how to move without being heard. How to test a victim without committing too early. A step closer. A pause, another step. If the man reacted, they'd stop. If he didn't, they'd continue. And he didn't. Not when shadows shifted closer to his cell. Not when whispered voices stopped pretending they weren't about him. Not even when the air around him changed, that heavy, unmistakable signal that danger is near. To experienced criminals, that silence meant something simple. This would be easy. Still, something felt off, not fear, not danger. Just a strange discomfort. The kind you feel when a situation looks perfect, but your instincts won't relax. Because men who truly give up don't sleep like this. They toss, they sigh, they show signs of collapse. This man looked composed, as if he had chosen this position, as if he trusted it. One of them whispered, barely audible, "He hasn't moved all night." Another replied, "Then he won't move now." That's how mistakes are born in prison, not from ignorance but from confidence. They told themselves a story they wanted to believe, that he was weak, that he was unaware, that he was safe to touch. And once a man becomes safe to touch in prison, his fate is usually sealed. They didn't know it yet, but in that moment, standing just outside his reach, they weren't hunting a victim. They were volunteering. Because in a place ruled by fear, the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate the wrong man. At this point, do you think they should walk away or keep going? Comment to WLK Waterway or keep you. They weren't impulsive men. That's what made them dangerous. In prison, the most violent inmates don't survive long. They burn too hot, attract too much attention, and eventually disappear into segregation, or worse. The men watching the sleeping prisoner were different. Quiet, patient, calculating. They didn't rush, they observed. Each of them had learned the same lesson the hard way. Power in prison isn't about strength alone. It's about timing, reputation, knowing exactly when to act and when not to. And so far, their instincts had never failed them. They had taken from men bigger than them, from men protected by groups, from men who swore they would fight back. Every time, the pattern was the same. Fear appeared first, then hesitation, then collapse. This was no different. At least that's what they told themselves. They studied the sleeping man the way mechanics study a broken engine. Slowly, from different angles, looking for weaknesses that others missed. His clothes were plain. Nothing custom. Nothing hidden in obvious places. No signs of affiliation. No markings that suggested protection. Nothing that said, "Don't touch this one." To them, that absence spoke louder than any warning ever could. Because men who matter in prison make sure everyone knows it. They sit a certain way. They move a certain way. They attract attention without trying. This man did none of that. He didn't posture. He didn't watch the room. He didn't even pretend to be alert. And in prison, pretending is everything. One of them leaned closer to the bars just enough to test the space. He expected movement, a shift, a tightening of muscles. Some sign that the man inside was aware. There was nothing. The breathing stayed slow, measured, as if it were controlled rather than unconscious. But they ignored that detail. People see what they expect to see. Another man quietly scanned the corridor. No guards, no witnesses, just shadows and steel. The kind of environment where consequences take a long time to arrive, if they arrive at all. They whispered low and confident. "He's alone." That single word changed everything. Alone meant no retaliation later. Alone meant no one to complain. Alone meant no one would remember. And they had learned long ago that memory is the most dangerous weapon in prison. Remove it, and you remove risk. Still, something kept them from moving forward too quickly. It wasn't fear. They had felt fear before. This wasn't it. It was hesitation without a name. The kind that creeps in when logic says yes, but instinct stays silent. They tried to explain it away. Maybe it was the way the man's hands rested, not clenched, not defensive. Maybe it was how his shoulders were open, exposed, careless. Maybe it was the complete lack of tension in his body. Experienced inmates know this truth, even if they can't articulate it. Men who are afraid are never truly still. This man was still. One of them smirked, shaking his head slightly. "Look at him," he whispered. "Doesn't even know." That confidence spread quickly. Confidence always does. It silences doubt. Turns caution into impatience. They had waited long enough. A foot crossed an invisible line. Then another. The sounds of the prison faded into the background as their focus narrowed. Every successful move they had ever made reinforced the same belief. They knew exactly how this would end. They imagined the moment the man would wake up too late. The confusion in his eyes. The sudden understanding that he had miscalculated. They had seen that look before. Many times it never failed to appear. And yet as they stood closer now, something else became clear. The man's breathing didn't change. Not faster. Not shallower. Not startled. It stayed exactly the same. Controlled. Almost deliberate. That should have been the moment they stopped. But confidence has a way of rewriting warning signs. Of turning instincts into background noise. Of convincing smart men that they're smarter than everyone else. One of them reached out, not to strike, not to grab, but to test. A light touch. Barely enough to be felt. The kind of contact that tells you everything you need to know about a man. Weak men flinch. Aware men react. Dangerous men do something else. But they didn't know that yet. They were still convinced this was just another routine moment. Another name that would be forgotten by morning. They believed they were in control. They believed they had chosen the right target. And they believed, more than anything, that their record would remain perfect. Because until that second, no one had ever proven them wrong. And that's the most dangerous moment of all, when men who have never failed are about to make their first mistake. Do you think experience makes people smarter or overconfident? Comment. A smarter or overconfident. There's a moment in every bad decision where the warning signs appear. Not loudly, not clearly, but quietly, like a thought you choose to ignore. This was that moment. As the men stood closer now, something subtle began to surface. Not fear, not danger, something harder to explain. a quiet resistance in the air, like the room itself was holding its breath. The sleeping man hadn't moved. But that, strangely, was the problem. Because when someone is truly asleep in prison, their body tells the truth. Muscles relax unevenly. Breathing changes with noise. The body reacts before the mind wakes up. This body didn't. His chest rose and fell at the same slow pace it had all night. No sudden inhale. No sharp exhale. No shift in weight when footsteps stopped just feet away. It was as if his body had already accounted for their presence. One of the men noticed his hands. They weren't clenched. They weren't limp either. They rested naturally, palms angled slightly inward, fingers loose, but positioned, balanced. As if they could move instantly without needing adjustment. That detail stayed with him longer than it should have. Another noticed the man's neck, exposed, vulnerable. The easiest place to control someone. And yet there were no signs of tension there either. No protective hunch. No instinctive curl inward. Most people protect their throat even in sleep. This man didn't. That should have screamed confidence. Instead, they translated it as ignorance. Because predators don't expect discipline where weakness appears. One of them shifted his weight, testing the floor. The faint creak of concrete echoed softly in the cell block. Anyone half awake would have stirred. The man didn't. But something else happened. His breathing changed, not faster, not louder. It sensed. As if the rhythm adjusted itself. Not consciously, automatically. The kind of adjustment that comes from repetition, from training. The men didn't consciously register that thought. It passed too quickly. Buried under confidence and momentum. But instincts don't disappear just because you ignore them. They whisper. They linger. They wait. A guard walked past the far end of the corridor and glanced in their direction. Not directly. Just enough to see shapes. He didn't slow down. That was another strange detail. Guards notice groups. They notice tension. They notice when something feels off. This guard didn't react at all. Almost like he expected nothing to happen. Or worse, like he expected something else. The men exchanged brief looks. No words, no retreat. Just a shared understanding that they were already committed. This is another prison truth no one talks about. The most dangerous step isn't the first one forward. It's the last chance to step back. That chance passed quietly. One of them leaned in closer now, close enough to see the man's face clearly. There were lines there. Not from stress, not from fear, from time, from control. His expression wasn't empty. It wasn't peaceful either. It was neutral. Completely neutral, like a mask that never needed to change. That unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He whispered, barely audible, "He's not normal." The words weren't meant to stop anything, just to name the feeling. But the feeling didn't stop them. Because once you label something as strange instead of dangerous, you make it manageable in your mind. They focused on the plan again. Simple. Clean. One touch, one reaction, then control. That's all it would take. The man closest to the bunk reached out slowly this time. Not aggressive, not rushed. His fingers hovered just above the sleeping man's shoulder. This was the final test. If the man flinched, they would back off. If he reacted, they would adapt. If he didn't, then everything that followed would be his fault. The fingertip made contact, light, almost respectful. For half a second, nothing happened. No flinch, no gasp, no sudden movement. Just silence. Then, something changed. Not in the room, in the men. Because the sleeping man's body didn't respond like someone who had been surprised. It responded like someone who had been waiting. The breathing paused, just for a fraction of a second. Long enough to notice, short enough to doubt. And in that pause, every instinct they had ignored finally caught up. Too late. Because the moment you realize you misjudged someone in prison is usually the moment you no longer have time to fix it. If you felt something was off at this moment, would you pull back, or go all in? Comment Paul BCK or go L ant. The pause lasted less than a second. But in a place like prison, a second is more than enough to change everything. The man's breathing stopped, not abruptly, not in panic. It stopped the way an engine shuts down when the driver decides it's time. That was the first mistake. Because men who are truly asleep don't control their breathing. Men who are pretending do. The fingers were still resting on his shoulder when his eyes opened. No confusion, no shock, no rush of fear. Just awareness. Sharp. Focused, immediate. The man closest to the bunk froze. His body reacted before his mind did. Every instinct screamed the same message at once. This is wrong. The eyes looking back at him were calm. Not angry, not startled. Calm in a way that stripped confidence instead of challenging it. And then came the second mistake. Instead of pulling back, he tightened his grip. In prison, once you commit fully. Hesitation is weakness. Weakness invites consequences. So he leaned in, applying pressure, trying to regain control of the moment. That's when the man on the bunk moved. There was no explosion of violence. No dramatic wind up. No wasted motion. His hand came up smoothly, redirecting the grip instead of fighting it. A simple adjustment. Almost gentle, but it changed the angle of everything. The man standing felt his balance shift, not enough to fall, but enough to panic. Because balance is life in close quarters. Lose it and you lose options. The others reacted instantly, stepping forward to surround the bunk. Too late. The man sat up in one fluid motion, feet already finding the floor, spine straight, posture perfect. He didn't rush. He didn't scramble. He rose like someone who had rehearsed this exact movement thousands of times. Still, no one spoke. Sound seemed distant now, as if the prison itself had leaned back to watch. One of the men swallowed hard. "You were asleep," he said. Not as an accusation, as a question. The man didn't answer. He looked at each of them slowly. Not sizing them up, not calculating odds, just acknowledging their presence. That was worse. Because people who calculate are uncertain. People who acknowledge are already decided. That's when one of them recognized him. Not from prison. From somewhere else. Somewhere older, louder. Public. His eyes widened slightly. Just enough. "No way," he whispered. The others didn't understand yet. They were still trapped in the moment, still thinking this was a normal situation that had gone slightly wrong. But it wasn't normal, and it hadn't just gone wrong. The man finally spoke. His voice was low, even, controlled. "You should step back." It wasn't a threat. It was instruction. That's when the realization hit them, not all at once, but like a slow collapse of certainty. This wasn't a weak man. This wasn't a careless man. This wasn't even a desperate man. This was someone who knew exactly what he was doing, and had known it all along. The name surfaced quietly, almost unwillingly, in one of their minds. Not shouted, not announced. Just understood. The man standing in front of them wasn't just a prisoner. He was Steven Seagal. The shift in energy was immediate. Fear didn't explode, it settled. Because fear born from surprise fades quickly. Fear born from recognition doesn't. They suddenly understood the stillness, the breathing, the posture, the way the guards hadn't interfered. It all made sense now, and understanding arrived with a heavy cost. One of them laughed nervously. "You're joking," he said. Steven Seagal tilted his head slightly. Not mockingly, almost curiously. "No," he replied. "I'm being polite." That was the final mistake. Because politeness implies restraint, and restraint implies what happens when it's removed. No one moved. No one needed to. The moment had already passed. They had crossed the line when they touched him. Everything after that was just realization catching up with consequence. Steven Seagal stepped forward, not aggressively, not fast. Deliberately. The men stepped back without thinking, and in that small, silent retreat, the hierarchy of the cell block changed forever. Because prisons run on one unbreakable rule. Once you show the room who you are, well, the room never forgets. At this moment, do you think fear came from his strength or from his reputation? The comment STRNGH or RPTDO and what followed wasn't chaos. That's what surprised everyone. In prison, moments like this usually end in noise, shouts, metal striking metal, bodies crashing into concrete. Violence announces itself loudly, almost desperately. This didn't. After the men stepped back, there was a stretch of silence so complete it felt unnatural. No one rushed forward. No one tested him again. Even the background sounds of the cell block seemed to fade, as if the prison itself had decided to listen. The man who had first touched him took another step backward. Then another, not because he was told to. Because his body understood something his mind was still processing. The others followed, spacing themselves out, instinctively creating distance. Distance wasn't safety, but it was the only option left to them. The man they had tried to rob didn't pursue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He simply stood there, and that was enough. In prison, dominance is usually loud and temporary. It has to be reinforced again and again. Fights repeat, challenges return, respect decays. But there is another kind of dominance, rare, permanent. It happens when everyone in the room reaches the same conclusion at the same time. This is not someone you test twice. One of the guards finally approached, not running, not shouting, walking, calmly. That alone sent a message. Guards don't walk toward danger unless they're confident it's already under control. He glanced at the men retreating, then at the man standing by the bunk. Their eyes met for just a second. No nod, no signal, just understanding. The guard turned away. No report, no confrontation, no questions. That was the moment the entire cell block noticed. Because when authority chooses silence, it means the situation has already been decided. The men who had planned the robbery didn't speak as they disappeared back into the shadows. They didn't threaten retaliation. They didn't promise revenge. They avoided eye contact. That told everyone else everything they needed to know. Word spreads fast in prison, but not through conversation. Through behavior. Through who sits where. through who suddenly eats alone, through who no longer walks confidently at night. By morning, the sleeping man's name wasn't spoken loudly. It didn't need to be. People knew. They knew because no one sat near him unless invited. They knew because paths subtly shifted when he walked through common areas. They knew because the men who had once controlled that section of the block now kept their heads down. No announcement had been made, but the hierarchy had changed. And it changed without a single punch being thrown. That's the kind of power most people never understand. Strength demands proof, control inspires fear, but certainty reshapes the environment. The man returned to his bunk later that night. He lay down the same way as before, hands resting calmly, breathing slow. But this time the room watched him differently. No calculations, no curiosity, no hunger, only awareness. Someone whispered from a few cells down, "He doesn't sleep." Another replied quietly, "He lets you think he does." The guard lights dimmed. The block settled. And for the first time since he had arrived, the prison adapted to him. Not the other way around. Because real power doesn't need to be displayed repeatedly. Once is enough if it's done right, and it had been done right. The men who had crossed the line learned the hardest lesson prison can teach. It's not the loudest person you fear. It's the one who never had to raise his voice. By the end of the week, no one questioned it anymore. The sleeping man had become a fixed point in the chaos, an unspoken boundary, a reminder. And whenever someone new arrived, nervous, restless, scanning for weakness, they were quietly warned, "See that bunk? Don't touch him." "Why?" "You don't want to know." The man remained exactly as he was before, calm, still, unbothered, as if the entire incident had been nothing more than a confirmation. Because for him it probably was. And that left one question hanging in the air, unanswered. If this was what happened at night, what happened the next day? Do you think true power is proven once or constantly tested? Comments ONCE or coastal morning in prison has a rhythm. Doors open, footsteps echo, voices return. But that morning, something felt different. It wasn't louder, it wasn't quieter, it was careful. Men moved with intention. They watched where they stood, who they passed, who they didn't. The cell block had absorbed what happened during the night, and like any closed system, it adjusted. No one approached the bunk where the man lay. Not to talk, not to test, not even to look for too long. That alone told the story. The men who had tried to rob him didn't show up for breakfast together. In fact, they didn't show up at all. One stayed back in his cell. Another switched sections later that day without explanation. No one asked why, because answers weren't needed anymore. In prison, reality is accepted quickly. You don't argue with gravity, you don't debate fire, and you don't challenge something that has already proven itself. The guards noticed too, not officially, not on paper, but patterns changed. Cells nearby received fewer random checks. Cameras lingered just a little longer in that corridor. Problems that usually required intervention didn't happen there anymore. Peace, in prison terms, had settled. The man moved through the day like nothing had happened. No boasting, no warnings, no attempts to control others. That was the final confirmation, because men who gain power and immediately use it lose it just as fast. Men who don't need to use it at all keep it. Someone new arrived that afternoon, young, alert, nervous in the way only first-timers are. He scanned faces, measured space, tried to read the room. His eyes landed on the quiet man. He leaned toward another inmate and whispered, "Who's that?" The response was immediate, sharp. "Lo, don't worry about him." "Why not?" A pause. "Because if you have to ask, you're already late." That was how the story traveled. Not as a legend, not as a boundary. By nightfall, the man returned to his bunk again, same position, same calm breathing, same deliberate stillness. But now the meaning had changed. Before, it looked like vulnerability. Now, it looked like confidence. The kind that doesn't need to watch the room, because the room is already watching you. And here's the truth most people miss. He wasn't pretending to sleep to trick anyone. He wasn't setting a trap. He wasn't waiting for a fight. He was simply being exactly who he was. And the prison learned the lesson the hard way. That strength doesn't always arrive with noise. That danger doesn't always announce itself. And that the calmest person in the room is often calm for a reason. The night before, they thought they had found an easy target. By the next day, they understood something far more important. They hadn't discovered weakness. They had discovered a limit. And once a limit is established in prison, it becomes law. The man closed his eyes again as lights dimmed. This time, no one questioned it. Because everyone knew the answer to the question that started it all. In a place where sleep can get you killed. Some men sleep peacefully because nothing there can touch them. And what happened after that, outside those walls, is a story very few people know.